The street was nearly empty, stripped of its daytime life by the enforced blackout. Only the faint glow of a covered lantern seeped through a shop window, smothered beneath layers of cloth. The air carried the damp smell of rain-soaked stone and old oil, clinging to the narrow pavement like a warning. Somewhere in the distance an engine coughed, then faded, swallowed by the night. Boots struck the cobblestones at measured intervals, slow, deliberate, unhurried. German patrols never rushed. They did not need to. At the corner of the square, a street vendor stood beside his cart, hands stiff from cold, breath visible in the thin yellow light. His name was not known beyond the neighborhood. He sold small necessities, matches, candles, scraps of wire, whatever civilians could still afford under occupation. His routine rarely changed. He arrived before dusk, left before midnight, and spoke little. Survival depended on remaining unremarkable. That night, his flashlight failed. The vendor pressed the switch again. Nothing. He shook it gently, then harder, listening for the familiar rattle of a loose filament. The silence that followed felt heavier than the darkness itself. Without light, even for a moment, he was exposed, another figure swallowed by shadow, another civilian subject to suspicion. He turned the casing, fingers numb, and caught a brief metallic click from inside, wrong in pitch, wrong in weight. The patrol boots drew closer. From across the square, a man paused beneath a shuttered doorway. His coat was too clean, his posture too still. He watched the vendor, not the soldiers. When the flashlight flickered briefly, just a breath of light, the man looked away at once, as if the glow had struck him like an accusation. Rain began to fall again, light but steady, tapping against helmets, soaking into wool coats. The vendor lowered his eyes, focusing on the broken object in his hands. Oil, old metal, something sharp beneath his thumb where it should not have been. He did not yet understand what he was holding, only that it was not what it claimed to be. The patrol passed without stopping. The boots faded. The square returned to silence. But the night had already shifted. A small failure, a broken flashlight, had disturbed something carefully hidden, and in the darkness of an occupied city, even the smallest disturbance could unravel a secret meant to remain buried. Long after the patrol disappeared, the vendor remained at his cart, the broken flashlight resting in his palm like an accusation. The square was silent again, but it was no longer empty. Silence under occupation had a weight to it, a pressure that pressed against the ears, forcing attention onto every small sound. Water dripped from a gutter. A shutter creaked somewhere above. Far away, a train whistle cut briefly through the night before being swallowed by distance. The vendor asked himself a question he had learned never to ask aloud. Why would a man flinch at light? In cities under German occupation, civilians learned to read fear in fragments. A glance held too long, a step taken too quickly, a pause where there should have been none. Survival depended on noticing without staring, remembering without recording. The man beneath the doorway had not looked like a criminal. He had looked like someone trained to disappear. The vendor examined the flashlight again, shielding it beneath his coat. The metal casing felt heavier than it should have. A faint smell lingered near the seam. Oil, not the common machine oil used for tools, but something sharper, treated, industrial. When he shook it once more, the sound inside was not loose wiring, but a compact, deliberate shift, as if components were locked in place. A normal flashlight did not behave this way. Under occupation, banned items were everywhere, hidden in false bottoms of carts, inside loaves of bread, beneath floorboards. Civilians hid radios, leaflets, and sometimes weapons. The Germans searched relentlessly for them, using informants and random inspections. Being caught with the wrong object was enough to disappear forever. The vendor knew this. He had turned in nothing before, asked no questions, and kept his head down. So why had this object unsettled him? The man in the doorway replayed in his mind. His coat had been civilian, but cut from better cloth than rationing allowed. His shoes had been polished despite the rain, and there was something else, something practiced in the way he had stood still while everything around him moved. Not fear of soldiers, fear of exposure. The vendor closed his cart slowly. The hinges creaked despite careful handling, a sound far too loud in the quiet square. He waited, listening for footsteps that did not come. Somewhere behind him, a window closed. Somewhere else, a door opened and shut again. Life continued, carefully, invisibly. The question returned, heavier now. Was the flashlight merely broken, or was it never meant to be ordinary at all? In occupied cities, sabotage rarely announced itself with explosions. It moved silently, through coded messages, concealed equipment, false identities. German intelligence networks relied on civilians who blended in perfectly, men who looked harmless and forgettable. If the object in the vendor's hand was not what it appeared to be, then neither was the man who had watched him from the shadows. The vendor wrapped the flashlight in cloth and slid it beneath the cart's false shelf, beside bundles of wire and candle stubs. He did not yet know what he would do. He only knew one thing with certainty. That night had asked a question the city itself could not answer, and once such questions were asked, they did not remain unanswered for long. The city lay along a river that had once been its lifeline and was now its boundary. Warehouses lined the embankment, their windows painted black, their doors sealed by curfews and regulations posted in German and the local language. Street lamps were hooded, allowed to glow only enough to prevent accidents, never enough to guide a bomber overhead. After dusk, the city belonged to shadows. The neighborhood where the vendor worked was an old quarter built long before motor vehicles or military columns. Narrow streets twisted between stone buildings, stained dark by centuries of rain and smoke. During the day, the smell of bread and boiled cabbage drifted from doorways. At night, those smells faded into dampness, coal dust, and the sour trace of fear. It was a place the occupiers patrolled regularly, but never comfortably. Corners hid too much. Windows watched too closely. The vendor himself was called Anton by those who knew him, though even that name was spoken sparingly. He had lived in the district his entire life. Before the war, he repaired tools and sold small household goods. When factories closed and rationing tightened, he turned to street vending, legal enough to avoid attention, useful enough to survive. His cart was plain wood, scarred by years of use, its wheels wrapped in cloth to quiet their movement over stone. Anton had learned the rhythms of occupation. He knew when patrols passed, when inspections were likely, and when it was safest to close early. He had watched neighbors vanish after careless words or unexplained searches. He had learned not to stare when German trucks stopped outside an apartment building, not to ask why doors were sealed afterward. Like most civilians, his resistance was passive. Endurance, silence, memory. The square where he worked had once been lively. A fountain stood at its center, now dry, its basin filled with rainwater and fallen leaves. Posters clung to the walls around it, German notices layered over older advertisements, edges peeling, text blurred by moisture. At night, the square acted as a crossing point between two patrol routes. Soldiers paused there, checked papers, lit cigarettes. Civilians passed through quickly, eyes down, footsteps soft. Anton's stall occupied a space just wide enough to avoid blocking the street. From there, he could see both approaches to the square. He listened more than he spoke. The sound of boots meant one thing. The rumble of engines meant another. The absence of sound often meant more than both. Since the occupation began, Unfamiliar faces had appeared and disappeared with regularity. Refugees, displaced workers, black market traders, all claimed plausible reasons for being there. German intelligence relied on this confusion. Agents blended into civilian life, renting rooms, adopting accents, carrying papers stamped with authority. Anton had never considered himself observant, but years under occupation sharpened habits into instincts. He noticed patterns without naming them, and recently, one pattern had begun to trouble him. A man had appeared in the area several times over the past weeks, always alone, always after dark, sometimes standing near the river, sometimes near the square. He never bought anything, never spoke. He watched. At the time, Anton had dismissed it as a coincidence. Cities under occupation were full of watchers. Only now, with the weight of the flashlight still present in his thoughts, did the city feel smaller. And Anton, an ordinary vendor in an ordinary square, found himself standing at the center of something quietly dangerous. The days that followed unfolded with the same outward routine, yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. Anton returned to the square each evening, pushing his cart through streets still wet from morning rain. The wheels whispered over stone. Church bells rang at fixed hours, their sound flattened by the low clouds. German loudspeakers crackled occasionally with announcements about curfews and ration violations, the words echoing off walls before dissolving into the city's constant hush. Anton kept selling matches and candles. He kept his head down, but his eyes moved differently now. The man appeared again on the third night. He stood near the river embankment, just beyond the square, partially obscured by stacked crates. A dim light from a guarded warehouse reflected off the wet pavement, outlining his silhouette. He wore the same coat, the same hat pulled low. When patrols approached, he did not retreat. He simply turned his body slightly, as if adjusting his stance, never leaving his position. Soldiers passed within meters of him without a glance. That alone meant something. German patrols were trained to notice nervousness. Civilians who froze or hurried drew attention. This man did neither. His stillness was practiced, his timing precise. When a patrol halted to smoke, he remained visible. When they moved on, he vanished into darkness without sound. Anton noticed other details. The man favored certain locations, places with clear lines of sight toward bridges, rail spurs, and power lines. He appeared on nights when freight trains passed late, their iron wheels shrieking faintly as they slowed near the yards. On those nights, Anton sometimes heard brief metallic taps carried on the air, too regular to be accidental, too quiet to be machinery. Once, as rain intensified and civilians hurried home, Anton watched the man exchange something with another figure at the edge of the square. The exchange was quick, shielded by a passing truck. No words, no pause. The second figure melted away immediately, leaving no trace but disturbed water in a shallow puddle. Anton's chest tightened as he watched. His hands smelled of wax and damp wood. The cart creaked softly as he leaned against it, pretending to rearrange his goods. He reminded himself that observation alone was dangerous. To notice was one thing. To remember was another. Yet the broken flashlight remained hidden beneath his cart, wrapped and silent. Each time he passed a German checkpoint, he felt its imagined weight pressing against him, though it stayed behind in his rented room. At night, he sometimes dreamed of it opening in his hands, revealing something that would condemn him simply for having seen it. The city itself seemed to sense the tension. Fog crept in from the river more often, blurring distances, swallowing footsteps. Sounds traveled unpredictably. A door closing 2 streets away sounded close enough to touch. Engines idled longer. Soldiers lingered. Anton began to ask questions without speaking them. Why here? Why now? Sabotage networks did not operate randomly. They selected locations with purpose. bridges, railways, depots, places that fed the German war machine. If this man was involved in something larger, then the square was not merely a crossing point, it was a node, and Anton, by virtue of standing there every night, had become part of its quiet geometry. The realization settled heavily. The danger was no longer abstract, it was standing in plain sight, waiting patiently, confident it would not be seen. Anton did not decide to investigate. Investigation implied intention, and intention was dangerous. Instead, he allowed habit to guide him, the same habits that had kept him alive since the occupation began. He watched, he listened, he remembered small things and refused to name them until they assembled themselves. The flashlight was the first piece he examined closely. In the privacy of his rented room, lit only by a stub of candle, Anton finally unscrewed the casing. The metal threads were unusually fine, machined with care rather than mass-produced. Inside, there was no simple battery arrangement. A narrow compartment ran along the inner wall, sealed with a thin brass plate. When he pried it open, a folded strip of waxed paper slid out, smelling faintly of oil and chemicals. There was no writing on it, only a series of tiny pinprick holes arranged in deliberate clusters. Anton did not understand codes, but he understood concealment. This was not a civilian tool. It was an instrument designed to pass through searches unnoticed, to appear broken or harmless when examined quickly, a signaling device perhaps, or a container for something meant to be destroyed rather than discovered. He replaced everything carefully, wiping his fingerprints away with his sleeve, and returned the flashlight to its cloth wrapping. The candle flickered as a gust slipped through the window frame, carrying the smell of wet stone and coal smoke. In the days that followed, Anton expanded his attention outward. He noted times. The man appeared most often shortly before midnight, usually within minutes of a freight train's arrival or departure. He counted the intervals between patrols, noticing how the man positioned himself where he could see both soldiers and infrastructure without appearing to observe either. One evening, Anton heard a sound he had missed before, a faint, rapid clicking carried across the square, masked by the rumble of a passing vehicle. It was followed by a brief pause, then another sequence. The pattern repeated twice, then stopped. When Anton looked up, the man was gone. The city's sounds filled the gap immediately. A dog barked somewhere. Water splashed as a cart passed. Life resumed its careful performance. Anton began to suspect radio signaling. Radios were among the most tightly controlled items under occupation. Possession alone could mean arrest. Saboteurs and intelligence agents used them sparingly, often breaking transmissions into short bursts to avoid detection. The clicking Anton heard matched nothing civilian. It was too structured, too precise. He also noticed changes among the Germans. Patrols began stopping more frequently near the river. Engineers inspected power lines during daylight. Soldiers questioned dock workers longer than usual, their voices sharp, impatient. Something had alerted German command to a vulnerability, even if they did not yet know its source. Anton felt the pressure mounting from both sides, though neither acknowledged him. Each night, he returned home with his heart beating faster, his ears ringing with remembered sounds. He washed his hands repeatedly, scrubbing away the smell of metal and wax as if it were guilt itself. He did not think of himself as brave. He thought of his neighbors, of the apartments above shuttered shops, of trains carrying fuel and ammunition eastward. If sabotage succeeded, reprisals would follow. They always did. Hostages, executions. Entire streets are punished for acts they did not commit. The clues had assembled themselves now, whether he wished them to or not. The flashlight, the signals, the watcher in the shadows. Anton understood one final thing with painful clarity. Doing nothing was no longer neutral. The city tightened around Anton like a closing fist. German activity increased steadily, not dramatically, but with the quiet confidence of men who sensed a hidden mechanism beneath the surface. Additional patrols appeared at irregular hours. Trucks idled longer at intersections, engines rumbling low, their exhaust mixing with the smell of wet asphalt and coal smoke. Soldiers knocked on doors after curfew, boots scraping against stone staircases, voices clipped and formal as papers were checked under flashlight beams. Anton felt every change. Each evening, as he pushed his cart toward the square, he listened for patterns that no longer held. Patrols arrived early, then late. Routes shifted without warning. The familiar rhythm he had memorized over the years dissolved into uncertainty. The square itself seemed altered. Shadows fell differently, fog lingered longer, and sounds echoed in ways that made distance impossible to judge. The man returned more frequently now. Sometimes he stood closer to Anton's cart than before, close enough that Anton could smell damp wool and tobacco. The man never acknowledged him. His gaze passed over Anton as if he were part of the street itself, wood, stone, debris. But Anton noticed tension in the man's posture, shoulders slightly raised, hands never fully relaxed, a readiness that did not belong to ordinary civilians. One night, Anton saw the man slip briefly into the dry fountain at the center of the square. He crouched there for less than a minute, shielded by darkness and mist, then emerged empty-handed. Moments later, a German patrol crossed the square and paused near the fountain, one soldier shining his light across the basin. The beam lingered, then moved on. Anton's mouth went dry. If something had been placed there, or removed, the margin for error was shrinking. Sabotage did not require large devices. A charge placed incorrectly, a signal misinterpreted, could draw immediate retaliation. Anton imagined doors kicked in at dawn, neighbors dragged into the street, names read from lists that no one had ever seen. At home, sleep abandoned him. He lay awake listening to the building settle, to distant engines and occasional shouts carried by the wind. The broken flashlight lay hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Its presence felt even when unseen. He imagined German hands discovering it, imagined the questions that would follow, the silence that would end them. The city's atmosphere turned heavy with anticipation. Fog rolled in thick from the river, swallowing entire streets. Under blackout conditions, the darkness became almost physical, pressing against the eyes. Sounds arrived without warning. A sudden cough, a footstep, the metallic clatter of equipment being unloaded somewhere unseen. Anton realized the danger was no longer limited to the man he watched. It had expanded outward, touching everyone within reach. The next time the man appeared, Anton noticed something new: urgency. The man checked his surroundings more frequently. His movements were sharper, less fluid. When a patrol approached sooner than expected, he retreated faster than before, vanishing into an alley without his usual measured calm. The clicking signals came twice that night, shorter than usual, abruptly cut off. German vehicles moved toward the rail yards before dawn. Anton understood then that whatever operation was underway was nearing its decisive moment. Either it would succeed or it would be discovered, and in either case, the consequences would be immediate and severe. Standing alone in the square, surrounded by fog and silence, Anton faced a truth he had tried to avoid. The window for choosing had closed. Only the moment of action remained. The night of discovery arrived without ceremony. There was no alarm, no sudden movement to announce it. Only a subtle wrongness in the air, a stillness too complete, as if the city were holding its breath. Fog lay thick across the square, clinging to the fountain and softening the edges of buildings until they seemed to dissolve into darkness. The smell of damp stone and river water hung heavy, mixed with the faint metallic tang of oil. Anton arrived earlier than usual. He positioned his cart closer to the fountain, the wheels muffled as always. His hands shook slightly as he arranged his goods, the waxy scent of candles grounding him in routine. Somewhere nearby, an engine idled briefly, then cut off. Footsteps echoed once, then faded. The man appeared from the riverside, emerging from fog like a thought made visible. He paused, scanned the square, and moved with purpose toward the fountain. There was no hesitation now. Whatever patience he had once displayed was gone. Anton watched as the man knelt at the fountain's edge and reached beneath the stone lip. His movements were quick, practiced. He withdrew a small object wrapped in dark cloth, larger than Anton expected, heavy enough to require both hands for a moment. At the same instant, Anton heard boots. Not the slow, predictable rhythm of a passing patrol, but the sharper cadence of men moving with intent. Orders were murmured in German, barely audible through the fog. A flashlight beam cut across the square, then another. The man froze. For a fraction of a second, everything balanced on silence. Then the man made a mistake. He reached into his coat and produced the flashlight. It flickered weakly as he tried to activate it, the beam sputtering against the fog. The broken mechanism betrayed him. The light failed again, leaving him exposed in partial silhouette. Hands occupied, posture wrong, movement unmistakably purposeful. A voice shouted. Rifles were raised. The man dropped the wrapped object and bolted toward the river, boots splashing through shallow puddles. Shots cracked through the night, sharp and deafening, echoing between buildings. Civilians slammed shutters closed. Somewhere, glass shattered. Anton did not move. German soldiers rushed past his cart without a glance, their attention fixed on the fleeing figure. One slipped on a wet stone and cursed. Another stopped abruptly, his light catching the fallen object by the fountain. He knelt, unwrapped it just enough to see wires, a metal casing, a clockwork mechanism. The realization spread instantly. Shouted orders followed. More soldiers arrived, their boots pounding, their breath visible in the cold air. Engineers were summoned. The square was filled with harsh light and noise, and the fog illuminated into ghostly shapes. The man did not escape. Anton heard the struggle near the river. Shouts, a body hitting stone, the dull sound of blows. It ended quickly. As soldiers secured the square, one officer's flashlight beam swept briefly across Anton's cart, pausing on the vendor's face. Anton met his gaze calmly, his expression empty, his hands still smelling of wax and wood. After a moment, the beam moved on. The bomb was disarmed before dawn. Anton stood in the same place until the sky began to lighten, his legs numb, his heart pounding long after the danger had passed. The city exhaled slowly, unaware of how close it had come to catastrophe. All of it unraveled by a single, broken flashlight. By morning, the square bore no visible sign of what had nearly occurred. Rain washed away footprints. The fog lifted gradually, revealing stone darkened by moisture, and the dry fountain returned to stillness. German trucks departed one by one, engines echoing through the narrow streets before fading into the broader city. Official notices appeared later that day, posted neatly on walls. Routine security operations, temporary restrictions, no cause for concern. But beneath the surface, the outcome was profound. The device recovered from the fountain was identified as a timed sabotage charge, compact but powerful enough to cripple nearby infrastructure. Its placement indicated a precise objective: damage to underground power conduits feeding the rail yards and river crossings. Had it detonated, trains carrying fuel and ammunition would have been halted for days. The German command understood immediately that this was not an isolated act, but part of a coordinated intelligence effort. Interrogations followed swiftly and quietly. The captured man did not survive long enough to speak publicly. His identity, pieced together from forged documents and coded equipment, pointed to a trained operative inserted months earlier under civilian cover. He had rented a room under an assumed name, maintained no known associates, and communicated only through short-range signals and concealed devices. His presence explained a series of unexplained security breaches that had troubled occupation authorities along the river corridor. German counterintelligence responded with predictable severity. Radio detection units were deployed across the district. Civilian buildings were searched, sometimes repeatedly. Curfews tightened. Permits were revoked. The neighborhood endured weeks of heightened scrutiny, the tension lingering like smoke after a fire. Yet no mass reprisals followed. The sabotage had been prevented before damage occurred, allowing authorities to present the incident internally as a contained threat rather than a public failure. For the resistance networks operating in and around the city, the loss was significant. A node had been exposed. Routes were abandoned. Messages went unanswered. Operations shifted elsewhere. But the greater catastrophe, the kind that brought executions and burned streets, had been avoided. Historically, such moments rarely appeared in official records. Intelligence successes were buried to protect methods. Civilian involvement, when it existed, was deliberately obscured. The occupation regime preferred to present itself as omniscient, unchallenged. Admitting vulnerability, even narrowly avoided, risked encouraging defiance. Yet historians later noted a pattern. In several occupied cities, sabotage attempts were disrupted not by sweeping intelligence breakthroughs, but by small local observations, objects out of place, routines broken, minor failures that exposed trained operatives to ordinary eyes. This incident belonged to that pattern. A device meant to remain invisible had failed. A man trained to disappear had been seen, and an act intended to unfold in secrecy had instead revealed the fragile line upon which occupation control depended. The war moved on. Front lines shifted. New crises demanded attention. But in one quiet city by the river, history had turned not on a battlefield, but in a fog-filled square, held in balance by a single, unnoticed civilian moment. Anton returned to the square 2 nights later. The routine had been officially restored. Patrols resumed their regular intervals. The fountain remained untouched, its basin once again collecting rainwater and fallen leaves. German notices still clung to the walls, but no new restrictions were announced. To the casual observer, nothing had changed. For Anton, everything had. He set up his cart in the same place, his movements slow and deliberate. The wood felt familiar beneath his hands. The smells returned. Wax, damp rope, wet stone. Boots passed, as they always did. Voices murmured. Papers were checked. The city continued its careful performance of obedience. No one spoke of the incident. Neighbors did not ask why the square had been sealed that night. They did not ask why the engineers had worked until dawn. Under occupation, survival depended on silence as much as on food. Questions invited attention. Attention invited danger. Anton himself was never questioned. The broken flashlight was gone, quietly removed by German security, along with the other evidence. No record connected it to him. No name was written down. His role, if it could be called that, remained unacknowledged, undocumented, invisible. That invisibility was the legacy of most civilians under occupation. In later years, historians studying German counterintelligence failures noted how frequently operations were compromised by chance encounters and civilian observation. Trained agents depended on a flawless routine. They relied on equipment that had to function perfectly, disguises that could not slip, and behavior that had to remain unremarkable at all times. When any part of that system failed, exposure followed quickly. In this case, the failure was mundane. A flashlight that weighed too much, a beam that flickered when it should not, a momentary hesitation noticed by someone with no reason to be watching, except that occupation had taught him to. After the war, the city was rebuilt. Rail lines were repaired, power systems modernized. The square regained its noise and movement. Children played near the fountain. Vendors came and went. Few remembered the night when silence thickened and danger moved openly through fog. Anton did not speak of it, even after liberation. There was no medal, no citation, no official acknowledgement. He returned to repairing tools when materials became available again. His cart was eventually sold for scrap. His life blended back into the ordinary flow of post-war years, but the legacy endured quietly. The incident stood as a reminder that wars are not decided solely by generals and armies. They also turn on unnoticed moments, on civilians who survive by observation, on small errors that expose carefully constructed secrets. In the machinery of intelligence and occupation, perfection was required. In the lives of civilians, attention was enough, and sometimes, in the darkness of war, a single broken object could illuminate far more than it ever meant to light.